The grand hall of the Zorvian palace was silent. Rows of armored guards stood along the walls, their expressions unreadable. The Zorvian king, Thalzor, sat upon his high throne, his dark robes flowing over the steps beneath him. His piercing, golden eyes studied the humans standing before him. Commander Rourke, a seasoned human warrior, remained calm under the king's intense gaze. He had seen many rulers, many warlords, and many battlefields. But this was different. This was no ordinary negotiation. At the center of the hall, standing between them, was Princess Alara. She was small, frail, and visibly weak. Her lavender-colored skin was too pale for a Zorvian. Her body, though tall and elegant, lacked the muscle tone of her warrior kin. Unlike the other Zorvians, who were known for their superior strength and speed, she was born fragile, sickly, and unfit for battle. She was an embarrassment to the royal family. The king finally spoke. His deep voice echoed through the hall. "Human, you are known for your ability to survive against impossible odds. You defy logic. You win wars you should not. You adapt where others break." Rourke said nothing, only nodding. He had heard these words before. "My daughter is weak." The king's voice was cold, almost emotionless. "She is not fit to rule. She is not fit for battle. She is a disgrace to my bloodline." Alara flinched but did not speak. She had heard these words many times. "I am giving her to you." The room tensed. Even the guards shifted slightly, exchanging glances. Rourke raised an eyebrow. "Giving?" The king leaned forward. "Train her. Make her strong. Make her something worthy of the Zorvian name, or let her die trying." Alara's hands clenched into fists at her sides. Her violet eyes flashed with something. Anger, frustration, or perhaps hope. Rourke studied her carefully. He had trained soldiers before, warriors who had seen the worst of war. But Alara, she was different. She had never fought, never held a blade in battle. And yet she was not afraid. Rourke turned back to the king. "And if I refuse?" The king smirked. "Then she remains here, unwanted, useless." Alara's eyes flickered with pain, but she remained silent. Rourke sighed. He had come here for a different job, a mission unrelated to this, but something about this deal intrigued him. What could a human warrior teach an alien princess that her own people could not? He glanced at Alara again. Her spirit was not broken yet. Finally, he gave a short nod. "Fine. But I don't train quitters." Alara's eyes widened slightly. The king only chuckled. "She will either survive your training, or she will prove her weakness." Rourke turned to Alara and gestured for her to follow. "Let's go, princess. Your life is about to change." The harsh reality. Hours later, they stood outside the palace, far from the golden towers and marble halls. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and metal. Rourke's personal training ground, located on the outskirts of the city, was nothing like the luxury of the palace. Alara looked around, her delicate hands gripping the thin cloak she wore. She had never been outside the palace walls without an escort. Rourke crossed his arms. "Rule number 1. I'm not your servant, and I don't care that you're a princess. Out here, you're just another trainee." Alara nodded slowly. "I understand." Rourke stepped closer, his tone firm. "No, I don't think you do. Your people see you as weak. They gave you to me because they think you're a lost cause." Alara swallowed hard, her throat tightening. "Prove them wrong." Silence. Then, for the first time, Alara lifted her chin, her eyes filled with quiet determination. "I will." Rourke studied her face, then smirked. Maybe she wasn't hopeless after all. The sun had barely risen when Alara was woken up by a sharp knock on the metal door of her training quarters. "Get up, princess. Your training starts now." Rourke's voice was firm, giving her no chance to argue. Alara sat up slowly, her body still aching from the long journey the day before. She had never slept in such a simple place before. No silk sheets, no royal comforts, just a thin mattress and a metal room that smelled of sweat and rust. She rubbed her eyes and forced herself to stand. She had promised to prove her father wrong. She had to do this. She stepped outside and found Rourke standing in an open field. He was dressed in simple training gear, his arms crossed as he watched her approach. The wind was cold, and the ground beneath her bare feet felt rough. "You're late," Rourke said. Alara frowned. "You just woke me up." Rourke smirked. "Excuses won't help you here." She sighed, but didn't argue. Rourke picked up a wooden staff and tossed it toward her. Alara barely caught it, struggling with its weight. "Today, we start with the basics," Rourke said. "Balance, strength, and endurance." Alara looked down at the staff, unsure. "Shouldn't I learn how to fight first?" Rourke shook his head. "You're too weak for that. First, you need to learn how to stand your ground." Alara's jaw tightened, but she nodded. The first lesson. Rourke led her to a small wooden beam, barely wide enough for her feet. "Stand on it," he ordered. Alara frowned but obeyed, stepping onto the beam. "Now hold the staff up and don't fall." She barely lasted 5 seconds before her body wobbled, and she fell to the ground. Rourke sighed. Pathetic. Alara clenched her fists. "I wasn't ready." "The real world doesn't wait for you to be ready." She gritted her teeth and climbed back onto the beam. This time, she lasted a little longer before falling again. And again. And again. For hours she tried, but every time she lost her balance. Her arms ached from holding the staff. Her legs felt weak. Finally, exhausted, she collapsed onto the ground, breathing heavily. "I can't," she whispered. Rourke knelt beside her. "Do you think warriors get to say that in battle?" Alara closed her eyes. Her father's words echoed in her mind. Weak, useless, disgrace. Her hands trembled, but she pushed herself up. Again. Rourke raised an eyebrow. "You sure?" Alara's violet eyes met his. "Yes." She climbed onto the beam once more. This time, she lasted longer before she fell. And she got back up again. The struggle. By midday, her entire body ached. Her arms felt like lead, and every muscle burned. Rourke tossed her a canteen of water. "Drink. You're no use to me dead." Alara drank greedily, the cool liquid soothing her dry throat. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "Making me stand on a beam for hours." Rourke sat beside her, his expression unreadable. "Because balance is everything. A warrior who can't stand their ground loses before the fight even begins." Alara looked down at her hands, covered in dirt and scratches. She had never been this dirty before, never worked this hard before, and yet she felt something new. Determination. She wiped her forehead and stood again. Rourke smirked. "Not bad, princess, but we're just getting started." The first test. As the sun began to set, Rourke brought her to a small pit filled with stones. "Jump across it," he ordered. Alara looked at the gap. It wasn't too wide, but for someone as weak as her, it felt impossible. "You have to be kidding." Rourke didn't smile. "Jump or go home." Alara's hands clenched. She would not go home as a failure. She took a deep breath and ran. At the last moment, she leaped and fell short. She crashed into the pit, scraping her arms against the stones. Pain shot through her body. Rourke walked up to the edge, looking down at her. Again. Alara groaned but climbed out. She tried again. And again. On the 5th attempt, she finally made it. Rourke gave a slow nod. "Good. Now do it 10 more times." Alara wanted to scream, but instead, she jumped. Again. And again. Her legs ached. Her breath was heavy. But with each jump, she felt stronger. When she finally collapsed onto the ground, she was exhausted, but she had done it. Rourke sat beside her. "You survived your first day. Let's see if you survive the next." Alara, breathing hard, smiled for the first time. She would. Elara's entire body ached. Every muscle burned, every joint screamed in protest. But she refused to stop. It had been 1 week since her training began, and she had barely slept. Rourke's harsh methods left her exhausted, her once smooth hands now rough and bruised. But she had changed. The weak princess who once struggled to stand on a balance beam could now run for miles without stopping. The girl who failed to jump across a pit could now clear it with ease. Yet, Rourke was not impressed. "You're getting better," he admitted as he tossed her a wooden staff. "But you still have a long way to go." Elara caught the staff, gripping it tightly. She was breathing heavily from the morning drills, sweat dripping down her face. "Then let's continue," she said. Rourke smirked. "Good, because today you face your first real test. The trial of the wastelands." Rourke led her away from the training grounds toward the Drackle wastelands, a vast, unforgiving landscape outside the city. The ground was cracked and dry, the air thick with dust. "You have one goal," Rourke said. "Survive." Elara frowned. "Survive what?" Rourke gestured toward the wasteland. "You have until sunrise to make it back to camp. Alone." Elara's heart pounded. "You're abandoning me out here." Rourke shrugged. "If you can't make it back, you're not strong enough." Elara clenched her fists. She wanted to argue, but she knew it was useless. She had to do this. Rourke turned and walked away, leaving her alone in the endless wasteland. The darkness falls. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature dropped. The once scorching land became bitterly cold. Elara wrapped her arms around herself, shivering. Her body was still weak compared to other Zorvians. She needed to find shelter. Her eyes scanned the terrain. There, a rocky outcrop in the distance. She moved quickly, but every step drained her energy. Her stomach growled. She hadn't eaten since morning, and the hunger gnawed at her. She reached the rocks and climbed into a small crevice. It wasn't comfortable, but it would keep her safe from the wind. She pulled her cloak tighter and closed her eyes, forcing herself to rest. But the wasteland was not silent. A low growl echoed in the darkness. Elara's eyes snapped open. Something was watching her. The beast. Slowly, she peered out of the rocks. Her breath caught in her throat. A Drackle stalker. The creature stood on 4 powerful legs, its long, snake-like tail twitching as it sniffed the air. Its black fur blended into the night, but its glowing yellow eyes locked onto her hiding spot. It had caught her scent. Panic surged through her. She had no weapons, no way to fight it. The beast let out a deep growl and took a step forward. Elara's mind raced. Running was useless. The beast was too fast. She had only one option. She grabbed a sharp stone from the ground and held her breath. Wait. Wait. The beast lunged. At the last second, Elara rolled to the side, slamming the rock into the creature's eye. The beast roared in pain, shaking its head violently. Elara didn't wait. She ran. Her legs burned, her lungs ached, but she pushed forward. She heard the beast's snarls behind her, felt the ground tremble under its massive weight. But she kept running. She spotted a steep ravine ahead, a drop too high to survive. But then she saw it, a narrow ledge on the side. She had one chance. Without thinking, she jumped. Her fingers caught the ledge, her body dangling over the abyss. The beast skidded to a stop above her, snarling. It couldn't reach her. Elara held on, her arms shaking. The ledge was crumbling under her weight. With a final desperate pull, she dragged herself up, gasping for air. The beast let out a frustrated snarl before turning away, disappearing into the darkness. Elara collapsed onto the ground, her entire body trembling. She had survived. The return. By the time the sun rose, Elara was exhausted. Her body screamed in pain, her legs barely able to move. But she didn't stop. She walked. Every step was agony, but she forced herself forward. Finally, just as the sun reached the sky, she saw the camp. Rourke stood at the entrance, arms crossed. She stumbled toward him, her clothes torn, her body covered in dirt and bruises. She met his gaze, her violet eyes burning with newfound strength. "I made it," she whispered. Rourke studied her for a moment before giving a rare nod. "Not bad, princess." For the first time, Alara smiled. She wasn't weak anymore. She was becoming a warrior. The morning sun cast a golden glow over the training grounds. Alara stood in the center, gripping a wooden staff. Her body ached from the previous night's trial, but she stood tall. The Dracal wastelands had nearly broken her, but she had survived. Now she was ready for more. Rourke circled her slowly, his sharp eyes scanning for weakness. "You survived the wasteland," he said. "Good, but surviving is not enough. A warrior does not just live. A warrior wins." Alara nodded. "Then teach me how to win." Rourke smirked. "Let's see if you're ready." The duel begins. He tossed her a second wooden staff and stepped back. "Show me what you've learned." Alara hesitated for only a second before she lunged forward, swinging the staff with all her strength. Rourke dodged effortlessly. Whack! His staff struck her ribs, sending her stumbling back. Pain shot through her body, but she clenched her jaw and refused to fall. "Too slow," Rourke said, twirling his staff with ease. Again. Alara adjusted her stance and attacked again. Faster, sharper. Rourke blocked every strike with ease, his movements almost lazy. Then, with a quick twist, he disarmed her and knocked her staff to the ground. Alara gritted her teeth. She refused to lose. She rushed forward, trying to close the distance. Rourke raised an eyebrow. Bold. He moved to counter her, but at the last second, Alara dropped low and swept his legs out from under him. For the first time, Rourke fell. Silence. Alara stood over him, panting. She had done it. Rourke chuckled as he picked himself up. "Not bad, princess." She smiled for only a second before. Whack. Rourke's staff struck her leg, sending her crashing down. Alara groaned. "You tricked me." Rourke extended a hand to help her up. Lesson 1. Never celebrate too early. Alara took his hand and smirked. Understood. The strength of a warrior. For the next few weeks, Alara's training intensified. She no longer hesitated in combat. She studied Rourke's movements, learned to predict attacks, adapted to every new challenge. She sparred with him daily, taking hits but giving them back twice as hard. She ran long distances without stopping, her endurance now rivaling even some of the strongest Zorvian soldiers. She trained until her body no longer felt weak. But strength was not just about physical power. It was about mind and spirit. One evening, Rourke gave her a dagger. Time for real combat. Alara frowned. Against who? Rourke pointed to the trees. Find out. The forest was silent as Alara moved forward, dagger in hand. She could feel something watching her. A shadow leaped from the trees. Alara barely dodged as a masked warrior attacked. She rolled to the side, her heart pounding. The attacker moved fast, too fast. But Alara was ready. She used Rourke's lessons, dodging, countering, and striking back. For the first time, she fought not with fear, but with confidence. The fight lasted minutes, but it felt like an eternity. With a final move, Alara twisted and disarmed the attacker. The masked figure fell to the ground. Alara pressed the dagger to their throat. Yield. The attacker hesitated, then removed the mask. Alara's breath caught. It was a Zorvian warrior, one of her father's own elite guards. The king's warning. Rourke approached from the shadows. Well done. Alara turned to him, confused. Why was he here? The guard slowly stood, his eyes cold. Your father sends a message, princess. Alara's stomach tightened. What message? The guard stepped closer. You were never meant to survive. You were given to the human because the king expected you to fail. Alara felt her heart pound. She had suspected it, but hearing it aloud, her father had never wanted her back. The guard's voice was like steel. If you return, you will be a threat, and threats to the throne must be eliminated. Alara gripped her dagger tighter. I see. The guard turned to Rourke. This training is pointless. She is weak. She will never be a true warrior. Alara moved before she even thought. Slam. She punched the guard across the face, sending him to the ground. Silence. The guard coughed, his eyes wide. You. Alara glared down at him. Say that again. I dare you. The guard hesitated. For the first time, he looked unsure. Alara didn't need his approval. She turned to Rourke. What's the next lesson? Rourke smirked. Lesson 2. Never let anyone decide your worth. Alara nodded. She had fought to survive. Now she would fight to win. The air was heavy with tension as Alara stood at the edge of the training grounds, her mind racing. The words of her father's guard still echoed in her ears. You were never meant to survive. Alara's hands clenched into fists. She had suspected this truth for a long time, but hearing it aloud made it real. Her father had never believed in her. He had given her away, expecting her to fail. But she hadn't. She had survived. She had become stronger. And now she was going to prove that she was more than just a discarded daughter. The final test. Rourke stood beside her, his arms crossed. He had watched her transformation over the past few weeks. The frail princess who could barely hold a staff was now standing tall and unshaken. Are you ready? He asked. Alara nodded. I am. Rourke smirked. Then let's see if you can win against a real opponent. He gestured toward the training field. There, 4 Zorvian warriors waited, their expressions cold. They were not like the royal guard from before. These were trained killers, handpicked by the king himself. Alara knew what this meant. Her father wanted to end her training before it went any further. He wanted her dead. But she wasn't going to let that happen. The battle begins. The first warrior lunged. Alara dodged, her body moving with a speed she never had before. The second warrior followed, swinging the sharp-edged training blade. She blocked, countering with a quick strike to his ribs. He grunted but didn't fall. The third and fourth warriors moved together, attacking her from opposite sides. Alara barely had time to react, her body twisting as she rolled between them, landing on her feet just in time to see the first warrior coming again. This time, she didn't dodge. She met his attack head-on, using her strength to push him back. Rourke watched from the side, his expression unreadable. She's learning. A warrior rises. The fight continued, each warrior testing Alara's limits. She was faster than them, smarter, but they were still stronger. One mistake, and she could lose. She had to think like a human. Alara waited for the right moment. The warriors surrounded her, expecting her to block. But instead, she did something unexpected. She stepped forward into their attack. The warriors hesitated, just for a second. That was all she needed. She twisted, grabbed one warrior's arm, and used his own strength against him, flipping him over her shoulder. The second warrior swung his blade, but Alara ducked, sweeping his legs out from under him. The third warrior hesitated, and Alara saw her opening. She landed a hard strike to his chest, sending him crashing backward. Only one was left. The final warrior stared at her. For the first time, there was fear in his eyes. Alara smirked. Do you still think I'm weak? The warrior clenched his jaw, but didn't attack. Instead, he stepped back and lowered his weapon. The fight was over. Alara turned to Rourke, breathing hard but victorious. He gave her a rare nod. Now you're ready. Return to the palace. Later that evening, a royal messenger arrived. The king had summoned Alara back to the palace. Rourke narrowed his eyes as he read the message. This is a trap. Alara nodded. I know, but I'm not the same person he sent away. Rourke studied her carefully. The determination in her eyes was stronger than ever. Finally, he sighed. Then let's make sure he regrets his mistake. As they prepared for the journey back, Alara felt something she had never felt before. She was no longer just a princess. She was a warrior. The trip back to the Zorvian palace was long and quiet. Alara's thoughts were filled with the battle she had just fought. She had defeated 4 of her father's elite warriors, warriors who had once been seen as invincible. Her body still ached from the fight, but a sense of pride and strength surged within her. Rourke walked beside her, his gaze constantly scanning the road ahead, ever watchful. He had trained her well, but he knew the palace was a dangerous place, filled with enemies waiting for her to slip up. When they finally reached the gates of the palace, Alara felt her heart race. It was here, in this very place, where she had once been treated as weak. A place where her father had cast her aside, as though she were nothing more than a failure. Now things would be different. The king's challenge. Inside the grand halls, the Zorvian king sat on his throne, his eyes narrowing when he saw Alara approach. His gaze was cold, but Alara didn't flinch. "I see you've returned," he said, his voice icy. "Did you enjoy your little adventure in the wilderness?" Alara stood tall, her posture firm. "It was a lesson I needed to learn, father, but I'm done running." The king's lips twisted into a cruel smile. "You've become a warrior, but you are still my daughter, and I will remind you of your place." Alara's chest tightened at his words, but she refused to let him see the doubt that might have once shaken her. "I will never be your pawn again." The king's eyes flashed with anger. "You think you can defy me? You think you can challenge me?" Alara stepped forward, her voice unwavering. "I am not here to challenge you, father. I am here to take what is mine." The king stood, his towering presence looming over her. "You think you can take the throne from me? You, a child who was never meant to lead." Alara looked up at him, her gaze steady. "I will take the throne, not because I am your daughter, but because I have earned it." The king's face reddened with fury, and for a moment, it seemed as though he might strike her down. But he didn't. Instead, he turned toward the Zorvian council, who had been silently watching from the side. "I will give you a choice, Alara. Challenge me in single combat. If you win, you can take the throne. If you lose, you will be exiled, and I will reign forever." Alara's heart pounded in her chest. This was it, the moment she had been preparing for. Without hesitation, she raised her head. "I accept your challenge, father." The duel. The courtyard outside the palace was large and open, the perfect place for their duel. Guards formed a circle around the area, creating a barrier between the combatants and the audience. Alara stood across from her father, her staff in hand. Rourke stood by her side, his face stoic but full of pride. "You've come a long way. Don't hold back now." Alara nodded. She had been trained to fight and survive. She had faced battles far tougher than this. She was not the weak princess who had been given away to a human. She was now a warrior in her own right. The king raised his hand, signaling the start of the fight. Without warning, he lunged at Alara with all the force of a battle-hardened Zorvian. His massive strength was overwhelming, but Alara was faster. She ducked and dodged, narrowly avoiding the crushing blow that could have sent her to the ground. She countered, striking at his side with her staff, but the king quickly blocked the attack with his forearm. He was strong, far stronger than she had imagined. But she wasn't intimidated. She wasn't afraid. Alara's mind was focused, sharp. Every move, every strike was calculated. She had trained for this. She had fought for this. With a swift move, she ducked under the king's guard and swept his legs out from under him, sending him crashing to the ground. The crowd gasped. Alara stood over her father, her heart racing. She had done it. She had outmaneuvered him. But the king wasn't finished. With a growl, he grabbed Alara's staff and threw it aside, charging at her with his full force. Alara barely had time to react. She stepped back, using her agility to evade the king's powerful blows. But the king was relentless. His attacks came faster and harder. For a moment, Alara felt her breath catch in her chest. The king was too strong, but she would not back down. Alara waited for the right moment, and then, with all the strength she could muster, she kicked the king's legs out from under him again, sending him sprawling to the ground. This time, when he tried to rise, Alara was there. She gripped his wrist and twisted it behind his back, bringing him to the ground. She held him there, the weight of the fight pressing down on them both. Victory. The king's face was filled with rage, but he knew it was over. Alara stood tall, her chest heaving as she looked down at her defeated father. I win. For the first time in her life, she felt true power. She had earned the throne, not as the king's daughter, but as a warrior. The Zorvian council looked at each other in silence, stunned by what they had just witnessed. The king slowly nodded, a bitter smile crossing his face. You have won. The throne is yours. Alara didn't smile. She didn't need to. She had already taken what was hers. Alara stood alone in the grand chamber of the palace, her gaze fixed on the window. The cool breeze from outside swept through the open space, brushing against her skin. The weight of the throne, of the crown she now wore, felt heavier than she expected. She had won. She had taken the throne, just as she promised herself she would. But as she looked at the palace, once a place that felt like a prison, she couldn't help but feel a wave of uncertainty. She was now the queen of Zorvia. Her father, the former king, had been forced to abdicate. Her mind was still processing everything. Her father's words, the battle, the endless training, the tests. She had earned it all. But now, what would she do with this power? Alara had always believed that her father's strength was the key to ruling. She had been taught that the strongest ruler was the one who wielded the most power, and that physical strength was the only measure of success. But now, having stood victorious before her father, she realized that strength wasn't just about power. It was about will. A royal address. Later that evening, the palace was filled with anticipation. The court had gathered in the grand hall, their eyes fixed on Alara. The Zorvian nobles and generals stood in silence, watching the newly crowned queen. Alara entered, her posture regal and proud. She had come a long way from the weak, sickly princess who had once been a joke in her father's court. Now she was a queen, a true leader, respected and feared. Rourke stood beside her, his eyes scanning the room. Though he had never sought power, he had helped Alara every step of the way. He had seen her grow, seen her become the warrior she was now. Alara looked out at the crowd, her eyes steady and determined. I stand before you today not as your daughter, but as your queen. The court remained silent. No one spoke, but Alara could feel their eyes upon her, judging her, waiting for her to falter. She had faced battles before. This was no different. My father's rule was based on strength, power, and fear, she continued. But those who rule with fear do not inspire loyalty. They inspire fear, and that is a dangerous thing. She paused, allowing her words to settle. She could see the nobles shifting, some of them uneasy with the shift in power. They were used to the old ways, the old order. Alara knew this would not be easy. I will rule with respect, she said. I will build a kingdom where strength is measured by courage, by heart, by the will to stand up for what is right. And I will lead by example. There was a murmur in the room, but this time, it wasn't one of doubt. It was one of recognition. Slowly, the nobles began to nod. Alara could feel the change in the air. She had not just claimed the throne. She had claimed their respect. A new era. Over the next few days, Alara worked tirelessly to set the tone for her reign. She met with her generals, discussing new plans for defense and the future of the kingdom. She met with the council to discuss trade, alliances, and the well-being of the people. She listened to their concerns, her mind sharp and her decisions fair. She had learned much in her time with Rourke. Leadership was not just about command. It was about listening, adapting, and understanding the needs of those you led. She had seen this in the humans, their resilience, their creativity, their ability to adapt to any situation. But there was something else she had learned, the importance of mercy. Her father had ruled with an iron fist, but Alara knew that true strength came from knowing when to show mercy and when to fight. As days turned into weeks, Alara's rule was cemented. The people of Zorvia slowly came to see her as not just their queen, but as someone who truly cared for them. She worked to improve the lives of the common folk, ensuring they had food, shelter, and protection. Rourke remained by her side, but Alara now knew that she was no longer just the girl he had trained. She was his equal, his partner in this new world she was building. They had been through so much together, and she knew she couldn't have done it without him. A quiet reflection. One evening, as the sun began to set, Alara walked alone through the palace gardens. She had spent years wishing for this moment, dreaming of the day when she would stand at the top of the palace steps, the crown on her head, the people of Zorvia at her feet. But now, with the weight of the crown pressing down on her, she couldn't help but think about the journey it had taken to get here. It wasn't the crown that mattered. It was the journey, the struggle, the fight to prove that she wasn't weak. Alara stood in front of the fountain, the water flowing softly. She closed her eyes, allowing herself a moment of peace. She had always believed that power was something to be earned through strength, but now she knew that power came from within. It came from the courage to stand up, the will to fight, and the heart to lead. Alara opened her eyes, the weight of the crown still present, but no longer a burden. It was a symbol of everything she had fought for, everything she had become. She had earned this throne, and she would rule it well.